mit der Akzeptanz der 4 Grundfreiheiten und dazu gehört auch die Freizügigkeit der Personen. Brexit means Brexit.
Hello and welcome to another Brexitometer brought to you by the Martin Center. Finally, after 3 votes in Parliament on Theresa May's deal and 2 extensions to the Brexit deadline, we don't have Brexit. The EU has decided to extend Brexit until the 31st of October, and make no mistake, it is the EU who decides the process and the timetable, while the UK accepts the decisions. Remember, taking back control? Exactly, me neither. The question now is, what does this latest extension mean for the EU and the UK? What are the most probable scenarios, and will Brexit ever actually happen? Brexitometer is here to give you the full rundown of the future direction of Brexit. Things may calm down in the following weeks, but make no mistake, there will be lots of machinations in London and in Brussels. And with EU elections, potential change of a Prime Minister in London, and an election or even a referendum on the horizon, Brexit will be back in the headlines before you know it. So let's unpack where we are now and where we are heading. The first obvious impact of the latest extension is that the UK will almost certainly hold the next EU election in late May, a full 3 years after the original Brexit referendum. This will be humiliating for the government, and it may create important political problems in the UK-EU relationship. On the UK side, everyone is afraid that the EU elections will turn into a rerun of the referendum, a polarization between pro-EU and anti-EU. And nobody is happier about an EU election than our old friend Nigel Farage, who has launched his new Brexit party, has promised to make life for the elites as hard as possible. Stuck awkwardly in the middle of all this are the Conservatives, the party who promised but couldn't deliver Brexit on time. They will silently be taking part in an election they promised would never take place. It's very embarrassing, and as we know, there's nothing worse for a British gentleman than to feel embarrassment. On the UK-EU side, however, having the UK elect MEPs is not a great prospect either. Even if the UK leaves in October, British MEPs will be part of the European Parliament when the European Parliament must do some pretty important things, like elect the next president and members of the EU Commission in the summer. With the UK expected to elect dozens of Eurosceptic MPs, it could deprive the main political groups in the European Parliament from a working majority and make the function and the decision-making process of the European Parliament more complicated and more difficult. Now, make no mistake, it may be embarrassing for the UK and will be entertaining to watch the UK hold an election it said that it would never hold, but the EU is not much happier about EU elections in Britain either. The second question about the new extension for Brexit is, what happens politically in the UK now? What is tricky about the 31st of October extension is that it is neither too short, as Emmanuel Macron was pressing for, nor too long, as some pro-Europeans in the UK were hoping for in order to avert Brexit. A lot had happened between now and then, but the timetables are really tight, so the real question is there enough time for enough to happen between now and then? If Theresa May fails again to pass her deal through Parliament, most observers agree that her position as Prime Minister becomes untenable. The Conservatives could elect a new leader, but in the UK, Prime Ministers elected by the party and their Parliament want to have popular support as well, especially if they're dealing with something as massive as Brexit. So is there enough time between now and the 31st of October for both a Conservative leadership race and a general election? And what does it mean for Brexit if the outcome of this process is a new pro-Brexit Prime Minister, somebody who campaigns and wins on the promise of a much more hardline position towards the EU, the dreaded Boris Johnson scenario? Are we back to no-deal territory in October? Then there's the prospect of a second referendum, which also needs a lot of time to materialize and be organized. Most people agree that we actually need a couple of months for a proper referendum to take place. So how could we actually even get to the point where a new referendum is agreed? Perhaps a Labour victory in a new election will lead to a new referendum and perhaps cancelling Brexit altogether? Maybe. But again, time is very, very short. What I'm trying to say here is that there is still some time for political movement to take place in the UK, but because there is not enough time, that political movement and those political decisions, and perhaps even some kind of a new popular contest, the British voters coming to the polls to vote on something, could actually lead the process very, very close to the 31st of October deadline. That means that things can get very, very messy again in October if there is no clear outcome of the political process in the UK and there is no agreement on how Brexit will be ending by then. So let's summarize the potential outcomes of Brexit based on where we are now. The first obvious outcome will be an orderly Brexit based on Theresa May's deal, probably after the Conservatives and the Labour Party agree on some kind of a customs union future relationship that they want to request from the EU, and then the EU actually agrees and grants them that, and both sides agree that this is going to be the framework of the future relationship after the divorce. Perhaps they could even agree on this, Conservatives and Labour and the UK and the EU, before May 22nd, and the UK can avoid holding the EU election and everyone can be happy and spare themselves the embarrassment. Let's not get too optimistic. This is a very improbable scenario, and chances are that Theresa May's deal will be dead by May or June. The second outcome would be a spectacular and shocking resolution of the UK's dilemma via some kind of a popular vote, as we discussed before. Two extremes are here probable: either no deal Brexit or no Brexit at all, either endorsed by the British people through some combination sequence of a Tory leadership race, new elections, and or a new referendum before October 31st. This would be the clarity scenario. Clarity wins and we're done with Brexit. Sadly, I think that there is another probable scenario, what I would call the DEJA-VU scenario. Now imagine the scenario. October 29th, October 30th, just a few hours before the expiration of the new Brexit extension, we're in Brussels, another emergency EU Council, and the British Prime Minister's car drives up to the building of the EU Council, and who gets out of the car? Theresa May, back in Brussels to ask for another extension, this one perhaps for years. Now this looks unlikely now, surely the Tories will get rid of Theresa May by summer, but if experience has shown us something, is that two things are unending in its life: Brexit and Theresa May as Prime Minister. The two live off each other, basically like two parasitic life forms. We don't know what the answer and the solution to Brexit may be, but perhaps the only solution to Brexit is Theresa May as a Brexit Prime Minister. So this is also a probable scenario. So this was the post-Brexit emergency summit, post-two Brexit extensions Brexitometer. Everyone can take a small breath before they get into the Brexit marathon again. There's a paradox here because most observers thought that a short extension would force the UK to make up its mind or crash out of the EU, whereas a longer extension would make Brexit a permanent problem for the EU. I actually think this medium extension actually achieves the worst of both worlds. It is long enough to allow the UK to continue talking amongst itself, but it's not long enough to force the British political system to come up with a solution and end this thing somehow. If I had to guess personally, I would expect the UK to come back to the EU on October 31st and ask for another extension, and the EU forcing them to accept a really long extension, one perhaps for years, attached with some strict conditions of what they can and cannot do as members, a kind of a quarantine membership. Brexit could become a permanent condition for the EU, which would have neither 27 nor 28 member states, would effectively have 27.5 member states. But that's just me, there's so many other scenarios, but we should really consider the possibility that Brexit can go on for a long time more. Now, of course, there's one good thing about a longer and longer extension of Brexit, and that's that the Brexitometer will continue being with you to explain to you the process. We will be here to answer all your questions. You can send me your questions using the hashtag Brexitometer on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. There will definitely be much more to discuss between now and October. Lots of time for you to send me your questions. Until next time, until we meet again, take care.
Mit der Akzeptanz der vier Grundfreiheiten und dazu gehört auch die Freizügigkeit der Person. Brexit means Brexit.